story. Let's cross to Brussels and Politico.eu's Nicholas Vineker. Thanks for speaking with us on France 24.
Great to be here.
But before I ask you about the matter at hand, let me just ask you this question, Nicholas. Sitting where you are in Brussels, because I know Macron is popular in the city that's EU headquarters. Do you spend a lot of time explaining to people why he's at 30% in the polls here in France?
I think it's hard to explain. He seems to have a reform program. He seems to have a direction of where he's going. And it can seem a little surprising that he has fallen so quickly and so fast. But there is a response to that question. It's pretty easy. And it's the economy, stupid. It's not improving fast enough. He's demanded changes and reforms. And the French people are not really seeing the results of those reforms quite yet. And I think that explains a lot.
He ran for president with this daring bet, which is, I don't have a political party. I'm going to blow up the system. I've never been elected to any position. I'm going to poach people from both sides of the aisle. Has his experiment sort of run out of gas at this point?
Well, it seems certainly to be in trouble because he brought in this very popular environment minister. He brought in a heavyweight socialist. He brought in various centrists. And none of these people could see themselves over the long term staying with Macron. And the problem was that the compromises that were required of them were too great. For Hulot, these were compromises on the environment, on his principles, and also on his brand as this very popular TV nature show host. And for Collomb, there was a lifetime of activism in the Socialist Party, and he couldn't square those principles with what Emmanuel Macron was doing on immigration. I think what we have is a failure to put forward ideas or reforms or changes that will really unify first the electorate, but also the government. And Macron has been so efficient with his reforms that he's forgotten about those kind of big unifying ideas and principles that could help people stay on.
One of the big criticisms leveled against him, there was a demonstration taking place this very Tuesday in the streets of Paris against pension reform, is that Macron is the president of the rich.
Right. Well, this is the one that's really stuck to his hide since long before he was elected. He had this reputation as a former Rothschild investment banker and someone who was aloof and distant. Here's one thing we can say. Macron has not done anything significant to dispel this notion. He keeps on telling us that there's going to be a change of style and that the presidency is going to be different. Well, what do we really hear? We hear these repeated gaffes where Macron says the same thing. If you're in trouble, if you're unemployed, it's partly, in fact, largely your own fault, and that you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and cross the street and find a job. This works in some places. It doesn't really come across well in France, and the fact that Macron keeps on doing it makes these errors look like self-inflicted wounds, like he's almost doing it on purpose. When he's backed into a corner, he returns to this idea that, well, everybody should just needs to fight for their own, what they deserve in the world. It's a very difficult message to hear when there's 9% unemployment in the country.
And we're looking in 6 months' time at European elections, Nicholas. The stakes for Europe are very high, it seems, in terms of whether or not this president who entered office on election night to the sound of the European anthem can succeed.
That's exactly right. the election in some ways can be, as certainly as Macron has presented it, is a clash between two opposing visions of Europe. On the one side, you have Macron's vision of Europe, which is statist to a degree, which is European, believes in the European project, believes in a certain degree of openness to immigration, culture, diversity within the body politic. And then you have the other side, which is more of a closed vision, against immigration, against too much dilution of a dominant culture. These two forces are going to come into conflict in this election. That's what both sides want. They want to frame this election as a big clash between open and closed. And what we can say for now is that Macron has not presented any strategic element that suggests his side is going to win, or that he's going to be able to build some kind of big liberal coalition in Europe. There may be plans in the works, there may be alliances with liberal parties in other countries, but so far we haven't seen the proof on the table, not enough of it in any case.
And just very briefly, Nicholas,
and his lack of popularity.
Very briefly, Nicholas, does he have time to turn it around? Is there time?
He has time to turn around his presidency, and he has time to win this campaign. The European election is not until May of next year. Most people don't even know that this is happening yet. This is not something Europeans worry about every day. He has time to strike alliances. He has time to build out his liberal coalition in Europe to take on the populist and illiberal leaders of Central and Eastern Europe, and he has 3 whole years in which to turn around his presidency. I'd like to end on a positive note. The Bank of France and the main statistical body in France have raised their growth provisions for the third quarter of this year. There is a light on the horizon. Macron always said his reforms would take time to have their effect on the economy. And what he can hope for is that simply the economy will start to improve and Macronomics, as we call them, will start to work. And he's got 3 years in which to do that. That's enough time.
Enough time. We're out of time, but I want to thank you so much, Nicholas Winokur from Politico.eu, for joining us from Brussels.